So hello and welcome to a conversation about the end of Roe, Texas, SCOTUS, and the urgent fight for reproductive rights. I'm Jeremy Paris, Vice President of the Northeast Ohio chapter of the American Constitution Society, which we call ACS, and I'm also a principal at the Raven Group, a national minority and women-led public affairs firm. ACS, which is the nation's largest progressive legal organization, has more than 200 student and lawyer chapters across the nation. We're thrilled that so many of our sister chapters are co-sponsoring this event. Austin, Houston, Milwaukee, Georgia, and our at-large chapter, welcome. Welcome virtually to Cleveland, and also welcome to the many of you joining us today who may just be finding out about ACS right now. We'd love to have you. I want to stress the urgent part of the title in our event today, of our event's title today. SB 8, the radical Texas ban on abortions after 6 weeks, has dealt a serious and immediate blow to women's access to abortion in Texas right away, right now, as we speak, despite the protections for the right to an abortion in the Supreme Court's landmark decision in Roe v. Wade, and despite its grounding in the US Constitution. Equally troubling, as we will learn about today from our expert panelists, is that the law is enforced not by the government, but by people turning in neighbors suspected of aiding or abetting an abortion after 6 weeks in exchange for $10,000 bounties. This is un-American, it is chilling, it is hard to hear about and talk about. And yet, the Supreme Court's right-wing majority had a chance to stop this law before it took effect, but they let it go into effect. Not only does this matter for the millions of women in Texas, but thanks to the court, copycat legislation is ready to pass in right-wing state legislatures across the country. People are starting to notice the role of a radical Supreme Court in bringing this about. The Supreme Court's approval rating is underwater for the first time in memory. Polling shows that clear majorities of Americans oppose the Texas restriction and the Supreme Court's decision to let it stand. An overwhelming supermajority reject the law's use of private bounties for its enforcement. This is my editorial 2 cents, and I hope you all forgive me, but the Supreme Court with a 6-3 majority of right-wing justices did not get there alone. Right-wing federal judges in Texas and on the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals have shaped this and so many other radical outcomes at the Supreme Court. And of course, these judges and justices didn't get there alone. They're a product of selection and prioritization of judges and putting them on the court by the conservatives. Any discussion of how we get past this moment of peril has to include how we change the federal courts at every level, making and nominating and confirming progressive judges a priority, considering Supreme Court reform, including expansion of the court to counteract the terrible decisions we're seeing today. Bottom line, we need courts, including a Supreme Court, that protects women's right to control their bodies, does not undermine that right. So what can we do, and how can progressives organize around the judiciary and around women's rights to help curb this coming onslaught against reproductive freedom? Wow, we have an all-star panel today to discuss this, and I'm really excited. I'm going to go ahead and introduce the 3 panelists, then you don't have to hear from me anymore, and they will lead and carry the discussion today. Jessie Hill is Professor and Associate Dean for Research and Faculty Development, and the ACS Faculty Advisor, I'll note, at Case Western Reserve University School of Law here in Cleveland, Ohio. She joined the faculty in 2003 after practicing First Amendment and civil rights law with the firm of Berkman, Gordon, Murray, and DeVan. Earlier, she worked at the Reproductive Freedom Project of the National ACLU office in New York, litigating challenges to state law restrictions on reproductive rights. In 2016, Professor Hill created the law school's Reproductive Rights Lab, where students produce research memos for real cases brought to her by advocacy groups nationally and across Ohio. She's also litigated to protect abortion access here in Ohio, including a recent appearance for all 16 judges of the US Court of Appeals of the Sixth Circuit. She will be leading our discussion today. Let me just introduce our other two panelists, then give a few notes, and then I'll hand it over. Dr. Jasmine Clark, so delighted to have you here, and thank you to the Georgia chapter, which came on board right away before we've been asked. Dr. Clark is in her 2nd term as representative for House District 108 in the Georgia State Legislature. She's the first Black woman elected to a rapidly diversifying district outside of Atlanta. As lecturer of microbiology and human anatomy and physiology at Emory University, and I'll admit I had to look up what some of these words meant. I'm just a recovering lawyer. Dr. Clark uses her scientific background as well as her focus on social justice to bring a unique and refreshing perspective to her role in the legislature, where she is at the front lines, and I know she'll talk about this, of so many of the fights we're going to talk about today. Dr. Clark is also co-host of the Suburban Women Problem, a a podcast produced by Red Wine and Blue, which talks to women across America about how politics affects their lives, their families, and how to become a part of the growing suburban women problem. Thank you to, I believe, Senator Lindsey Graham for coining the term. Last, but certainly not least, especially in my household, is Katie Paris. I would say no relation, but obviously absolutely a relation. The founder of Red Wine and Blue, an organization that mobilizes suburban women to change their communities in her home state of Ohio and across the United States. Before focusing her strategic and organizing chops here at home, Katie was Senior Vice President of Media Matters for America, which she helped launch as its first research director in 2004. She also helped launch Faith in Public Life, a strategy center that advances faith in the public square as a powerful force for justice, compassion, and the common good. She's also, I note, the coach of our son's soccer team, and they have a big game coming up this weekend. We have to have a bounce back win, Coach Katie. Two quick notes before we get started. One, you will see a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, not a chat button, but the Q&A button is where you can post questions, and we'll try to get to as many as we can before the end of this program. Please feed them to us, and thank you in advance. Also, this is a reminder for our panelists, as well as people asking questions. ACS is a nonprofit, nonpartisan 501c3 organization. We do not support or oppose candidates or political parties. Thank you so much for being with us today. Professor Hill, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, and I'm really thrilled to be here for this very important event. So I want to start out just by giving a quick overview to make sure we're sort of all on the same page about what this Texas law is, what is going on with it right now, and then to give a little bit of a broader context, legal context around how did we get here, and sort of what happens next. So Texas SB 8 is a law that bans abortion as soon as fetal cardiac or embryonic cardiac activity can be detected, which is as early as 6 weeks of pregnancy. This law banning abortion at this early stage is clearly unconstitutional, and that's not really even in question. No one's really arguing otherwise. Under existing precedent, under Roe v. Wade, Planned Parenthood v. Casey, you cannot ban abortion before fetal viability, and that comes much later in pregnancy. 6 weeks of pregnancy is before most people even know they're pregnant. But what is, of course, unique about SB 8, there have been other laws like this. They've been challenged, they've been struck down. SB 8 is harder to challenge for two reasons. So normally you have two options with an unconstitutional law. You can either go to court ahead of time before it goes into effect and challenge it as unconstitutional and hopefully get an order blocking the law before it goes into effect. Or the less desirable option, you can wait and violate the law and then defend on the ground that the law is unconstitutional. And SB 8 is actually designed to cut off both routes. So it's, as you know, and has been widely reported, because the law is enforced only by private lawsuits and through this sort of private bounty system, you cannot easily sue ahead of time to block the law because you need a defendant to sue. And normally that defendant would be the government official charged with enforcement of the law. That's how it is in all of the other cases challenging heartbeat, so-called heartbeat bans. Here, because it's only private individuals and we don't know who might bring a private lawsuit, there's no obvious defendant to sue that has any connection to the enforcement of the law. So that's one problem. But then the problem with waiting and violating the law and then defending that lawsuit is that the law is written in such draconian terms. The penalties are enormous. You can be sued. It's at least $10,000 minimum per abortion. You can be sued multiple times for the same abortion. You can be sued in any county where anyone lives who wants to sue you in Texas. There are all these other provisions that make it a very problematic, troubling law that really makes the risk of suing or of being sued too great for most people to want to take, even knowing that you have a strong legal defense. So that has meant that the status on the ground in Texas, as you've probably heard, is that no one or almost no one is violating the law, that there's no abortion access past 6 weeks of pregnancy, that access is absolutely decimated in the state, and it's frankly, talking to folks who are working with folks there, it's just harrowing, really, really a terrible situation. It is like pre-Roe v. Wade in Texas. There are some lawsuits. I'm not going to go into any detail about those, but just mention that providers did try to bring a lawsuit before the law went into effect. This is the case in which the Supreme Court declined to step in, saying that the procedural issues were really complicated here, and that it was basically unwilling to kind of give the providers, the abortion providers, the benefit of the doubt, and that this lawsuit could even be brought. And so that case is ongoing, but the Supreme Court declined to step in and prevent the law from going into effect while the litigation against the law is ongoing. There have been some lawsuits brought by Planned Parenthood in state court. They've gotten some very limited orders, but that really don't open up access at all at this point in Texas until those lawsuits kind of make their way up through the Texas Supreme Court and reach a higher level where they're binding on more parties within Texas. And then finally, you heard about the Federal Department of Justice lawsuit against Texas. Again, no relief yet. There's been no court order yet in that lawsuit, no success yet, although that is still ongoing. That is a really very brief overview. I just want to say like a few quick words about how we got to this point and what it all means. As Jeremy mentioned in his opening remarks, 6-3 supermajority of conservative justices clearly opposed to abortion rights, clearly opposed to Roe v. Wade. But also, I just want to point out that the decision not to intervene to block this law was 5-4. So Chief Justice Roberts had actually joined with the 3 liberals and had said that the law should be blocked while the litigation plays out. And now, again, this ruling was not at this stage about whether or not the law itself was constitutional. It was just to say, should the status quo be preserved while the law plays out? But seeing that Roberts was with the 3 liberal justices shows you how critical it was that Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg was replaced by Justice Amy Coney Barrett. I guess she died just about a year ago. She would have been the one more critical vote there, or Roberts would have been the critical swing vote that would have resulted in a different outcome in that case. So we can very concretely see how the replacement of Justice Ginsburg by Justice Barrett made all the difference in this case. Just a couple other points. All of this is playing out in the shadow of a major case that's going to be argued on December 1 in the Supreme Court, dealing with a law out of Mississippi banning abortion at 15 weeks, in which the Supreme Court is explicitly considering whether to overturn Roe v. Wade. And the fact that the Supreme Court didn't intervene here, it's hard to know whether to read something in about that Mississippi case, but it might be the case that the Supreme Court didn't see fit to preserve abortion access and preserve the status quo because it's maybe thinking that the status quo is not long for this world in any case, in light of what's going to happen in the Mississippi case. And finally, one final point, that this is part of a really broader strategy, as Jeremy alluded to, not just at the Supreme Court level, but of packing the lower federal courts with conservative and particularly anti-abortion judges, to the point that the federal courts are now extraordinarily hostile in most places to the to Roe, to Casey, to abortion rights. And although the Supreme Court's action was obviously critical in this case, it's worth paying attention to the role that the Fifth Circuit played as well in basically allowing this appeal to happen and then staying the lower court decision, kind of gumming up the entire works when there was a really strong legal argument that the case should have continued to go forward as to at least one defendant. in the trial court and should not have been put on hold. It was the Fifth Circuit that initially put the case on hold, requiring the clinics to go up to the Supreme Court and ask it to intervene. And that this sort of aggressive action to limit and restrict abortion rights is playing out in the lower courts, lower federal courts as well, and with no change on the immediate horizon in that respect. So that's where we stand right now. I want to stop talking and just turn it over next to Jasmine, who I think is going to share her perspective as a state legislator in Georgia.
Thank you so much, Jessie, and thank you for giving us that rundown of exactly what SB 8 does. As you stated, and as Jeremy also stated in the introduction, I am a state legislator here in Georgia, and I'm also a lecturer. So I want to start off by, putting on my anatomy and physiology professor hat and just say, number one, that language matters. And so I really appreciate that we're using the proper language to discuss embryonic and fetal development as we're talking through these things. Specifically, there is a difference between an embryo, a fetus, and a baby. And a lot of times these laws are written, and the things that come out about the law, the marketing behind it, is meant to invoke emotions. And therefore, they use language that is medically inaccurate. So when we're talking about anything prior to 6 weeks, we are talking about an embryo. After 6 weeks up to birth, we are talking about a fetus, and then it is only a baby once birth or labor and delivery has happened. I also want to clarify 6 weeks because the governor of Texas is clearly very confused. And so if anyone else is confused, I want to make sure we're all clear. When a person is 6 weeks pregnant, that does not mean that they have known they are pregnant for 6 weeks. That is usually about 2 weeks after a missed period. And for some women who do not have regular cycles, which is a lot of women, that time frame may not necessarily be very clear. So it is very true that there is a large number of women who do not even know that they are pregnant at 6 weeks, or what we would term the 6 week mark for a pregnancy. And so taking my anatomy and physiology professor hat off and putting on my legislator hat, here in Georgia, just like across the nation, reproductive rights are really in jeopardy. Right now in Georgia, abortion is still legal, and but that is tenuous. We actually had a bill that passed recently, House Bill 481, that banned abortion in Georgia after 6 weeks upon hearing embryonic heart tones. However, that bill was stayed by the court, so there was no, it was stopped or blocked by the courts, but that is actually being heard this week. Oral arguments will begin this week on Friday, September 24th. So time is of the essence, and urgency is definitely the correct word to use in this situation. This is urgent. Reproductive rights are really on the line here for a lot of people and a lot of Georgians. At the same time that a lot of Georgians do not have access to some of the most basic things that they need for themselves, let alone to start a family. Along with that, along with hearing the oral arguments in the Court of Appeals on Friday, we have had almost 900 state legislators across the country, including a majority of the members of the Democratic caucuses in our General Assembly, sign on to an amicus brief that is in opposition to that Supreme Court case that you mentioned, or that Jessie mentioned, the December 1st Supreme Court case against Mississippi's 15-week abortion ban. And that's the Dobb v. Jackson's Women's Health Organization court case. So there are a lot of state legislators across the board who are in opposition to these restrictive abortion laws, and who are doing everything they can to let it be known that we will not stand for reproductive rights being taken away from so many Americans. You know, there is also an amicus brief in support, and that amicus brief only has about a third of the number of state legislators compared to the amicus brief in opposition. So I think that is a good sign, and we hope that the courts will stick with precedents here, and because there is plenty of precedents already showing that these bans are unconstitutional. But when Texas's SB 8 passed and got through the hurdle of not being taken up by the courts, that set off a chain of events across the country, including right here in Georgia and many other states, where these legislatures were salivating at the opportunity to rip away reproductive rights. And right here in Georgia, a state senator, Butch Miller, who is also running for an office, so this is probably a little mixture of campaign material for him, signaled to several media outlets that Georgia will likely see a copycat of SB 8. Well, here's the problem with that. First, as I mentioned, House Bill 481 did pass in Georgia, but it barely passed. It had bipartisan opposition. So there were both Democrats and Republicans who voted no on that bill. It passed by 2 or 3 votes in the state house. And it also made exceptions for rape, incest, and medical inviolability, which the Texas SB 8 does not do. And so SB 8 honestly would be too radical for Georgia, and I do not see it getting over even the legislative hurdle, but it's something that we still have to keep in mind. Secondly, in Georgia, we just passed, and there was a lot of fanfare about it, we just passed a law with bipartisan support, and with the governor having all of these, press conferences and celebrations, and everyone joining hands in kumbaya about the repeal of citizens' arrest. So we already have a case where Georgians have rejected vigilantism, and we don't need a bill that tries to bring that back. And so what I would say for those who are listening and who might be feeling like, well, what is it that I can do? This is where, number one, it's very important to know who your state legislator is, and it's very important for your state legislator to know who you are. Reaching out to your state legislator right now is very important, because it is the state legislatures that are driving this, and it is the courts that, unfortunately, in this case, are reinforcing it. And so it starts in the legislature. It's really important that you let it be known how you feel about this, no matter what side of the political spectrum you're on. And I say that because I have spoken to constituents, both Democrat and Republican, and no one wants to go back to the pre-Roe v. Wade days. They do not, especially many of my older constituents who are very conservative, but they remember the times before we had, or they remember the times when abortion was illegal and what that led to. Because the truth is, when it comes to safe and legal abortions, that is the best way to deliver that service, because you're not going to stop abortions by outlawing it. You just stop safe abortions. And that is not what we want for anyone. That is not what we want for our states. And that's not what we want for our country as a whole. And so with that, I am going to pass the baton on to Katie Paris, my friend, and also a part of Red, Wine, and Blue, and who helps us with the Suburban Women Problem, or invited me to be on Suburban Women Problem. Thanks, Katie.
Absolutely. Hi, Jasmine. It's so fun to get to do this with you. And hearing you speak just now is, I mean, this is why Jasmine makes such an amazing podcast host, actually, because of how clearly she explains things. And I so appreciate that about you, Jasmine. I also appreciated you calling this too radical for Georgia. As someone who was originally from Atlanta, Georgia, I have been wanting to hear the trends shift that way for a long time. And I know how glad we all are to be hearing that that is the case today. So yes, I'm the founder of Red, Wine, and Blue, which is a trusted community of suburban women. More than 250,000 women engage with us across platforms, including about 100,000 every single day, just in our Facebook community alone. Just to give you a sense of how active this group of women is, we were one of the top 10 most active civic groups on the entire Facebook platform in the lead up to the 2020 election. Unlike Facebook, however, our values are truth, inclusivity, vulnerability, and courage. We really work to amplify and empower women to shift media narratives and fight disinformation in the most divided places in America, where, as we all know, it's just running rampant. One way that we do that is through the Suburban Women podcast that Jasmine hosts, of course. We create a lot of content to give women something to grab hold of and feel a part of a community of women who are wanting to get more information and help change their communities together. And we also just do that day to day in our community building on Facebook and other platforms. And what this amounts to is that we are hearing a lot every single day from women across America who do live oftentimes in places where those Trump flags are still flying. So I just wanted to share. I think I was asked to speak today in particular because our community of women, they're not necessarily political activists. They are women who care about what's going on around them, probably became more aware of those things in the last several years, and they want to do something about it. And you know, my main message I hope I can convey today is that among these women, this issue is highly, highly salient. So on any given day where we are having these, you know, many thousands of women interacting together online and within local communities, and then more broadly nationally, number one issue we are still hearing about day to day absolutely is COVID, concerns about everyone getting vaccinated, masking in schools, COVID-related issues. But second to those issues is this. It is this Texas law. It is on the minds, it is on the lips of women, you know, and this is not headline news anymore. It should be, but it's not day to day at this point, but this is still what they're talking about. And it is highly, highly personal. You know, many of the posts have just been heartbreaking, often very inspiring because of the extent to which women really want to be there for each other, reach out to each other. There has been a trend across social media platforms, and it's been very present within our community, of women who live in states outside Texas, reaching out, saying to women inside Texas, you know, say, I'm here if you need me. I'm gonna quote some of the conversations without naming names from our community, just to give a sense. You know, a post that got shared very widely and there was a lot of conversation from our community was, hey, Texas women folk, if you need to visit your Auntie Rebecca in Oregon, just PM me. No judgment, no questions. You pay for the trip, or we'll figure out that part, and I'll be here. Pick you up from the airport, hold your hand, make some reservations, give you a peaceful place to escape. We'll take some selfies, see the sights, you know, for your social media, just to prove you're all good. And you will be all good. I know I was twice. Let's face it, it's been too long since we've seen each other. So these are really personal conversations happening, not technical policy discussions about this bill. There's been long threads of women sharing with each other how many bounties they'd owe for helping people in their lives if this Texas abortion ban had been in place at the time. When I shared with our community, actually, that I was going to be participating in this call, there was just overwhelming support from these women. And again, people sharing stories. One said, "Good luck, be fierce." I had a friend who rode a bus to New York City, one of the two places in the US where abortions were legal at the time, from Kentucky. She was 18 and went alone. She ended up hemorrhaging in the subway station and nearly died. Abortions will happen, even if not legal. It will be harder and less safe, which sounds exactly like what Jasmine just told us. So you don't have to be a state legislator to know that this is real in women's lives. I also just want to point out that this really goes beyond any labels of pro-life and pro-choice. Abortion is typically thought of, the most divisive issue in American politics. Our group has women with a range of backgrounds. Maybe they come from very conservative areas or conservative families. They are in different places on their civic and political engagement journeys. But I just can tell you that this issue is actually not divisive among them. I have some people on various issues, some women that I go to for gut checks, just to really feel how is something playing in different communities. And one of those women who I checked in with within 24 hours of the Supreme Court not stopping the Texas law to go into place, she was raised very conservative, evangelical, very conservative pro-life background. I think grew up even protesting abortion clinics. And I asked her, how's this playing in your parts from folks you're hearing? And her response was to share with me a meme, one of my favorites that has gone around quite a bit now, but the one that says Texas, where a virus has reproductive rights, but women don't. So that contrast between how COVID, of course, is being handled and now just this extreme law when it comes to reproductive rights is not really being lost on anyone. So I think that we need to, in this context, recognize maybe abortion isn't such a wedge issue after all. Maybe it's even a unifying one. So all the more reason for us all to be vocal on this. I also just want to point out that this is not a distant issue sort of popping up all of a sudden in women's lives. We all know about the attempts at the state level to erode reproductive rights for years now. Also more recently happening in communities in Texas, Ohio, and other places, local communities, townships and cities have been adopting sanctuary cities for the unborn type resolutions locally passed by city councils. Oftentimes these cities and towns don't even have any abortion clinics in them, but they are passing these all out extreme bans themselves. And so women are used to hearing about this stuff. Also, of course, with the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg and it being a year since then, I can't say anyone is surprised by this, but it is there's a real knowing, a real sense of this issue being close to home, and that this is very real. This is not an academic exercise. So really, the bottom line that I just want to communicate is that women see the Texas law as extreme. You don't have to be a political activist to see that. You don't have to come from a certain political or ideological background to see that. They see this as a highly, highly personal issue. Everyone has been impacted by it somehow through their own lives or the lives of people that they love. And they see this as a moment of action, a resounding refrain. It's just, what can we do? What can we do? What can we do? So women will be doing much. They have been giving, they have been signing on to things, pledging to march on October 2nd all over this country, organizing and making clear that this will influence their vote in elections to come.
Wow, thank you. Thanks so much for that perspective. Both of you, actually, that was wonderful. I'm going to sort of transition into my professor / moderator role now, as we all have our cameras on. And ask a few questions to kick off this discussion portion, but also welcome the audience, all of you, to drop questions in the Q&A, please, and then I will also be sharing those with our panelists. So I want to start with a question to you, Jasmine, although it's kind of coming from Katie's point that I really liked, that, this is not as much of a quote unquote wedge issue as, maybe some people would like to paint it as. There's actually a lot more support for abortion rights than we might think. And that, as you said, Jasmine, this is too radical even for Georgia. And yet, right, we are likely to see copycat legislation some places. I know in Ohio, it's being talked about as well. We have an extremely gerrymandered state legislature that may get even worse. And I guess, I'd love to hear your thoughts on what folks who are in the minority in terms of political representation on this issue can do, either within the legislature or outside the legislature, to push back against abortion restrictions that are really just at epidemic proportions across the country.
So thank you for the question, Jessie. And I think that the important thing to realize in this is that people across the political spectrum oppose these types of laws. They oppose these extremely radical types of laws. They see this for more than just what the GOP would like for people to see this as. So a lot of times the laws that are promoted by the GOP are rooted in fear. Mm-hmm. And the thing about it is, when it comes to this particular issue, there are women on both sides of the aisle that have stories that, are not just what you would consider your quote prototypical abortion that GOPers would like for you to believe that these bans are going to stop. So, when it comes to making, life-changing medical decisions, often very quickly, women want to be able to have choices. Families want to be able to have choices. They do not want the government intervening in this. And so as state legislators, especially ones in the minority, I think we continue to tell the truth, because honestly, the numbers are on our side. Here in Georgia, 77% of people support abortion being legal and safe. And a lot of that just has to do with, like I said, they just know people. They know someone who they care about, who has had to go through this medical procedure, and they do not want to see people's medical options, because that is what an abortion is, being stripped away by the government, especially by people who don't even actually know what 6 weeks pregnancy even is. So I think that's important. And so we keep telling the truth. We keep letting people know, because the numbers are on our side. Now, yes, these things get passed, but a lot of times, like I said, in Georgia, the one that did pass, it barely passed. It was 2 people taking a bathroom break away from not passing in Georgia. So, this is it's not something that's as cut and dry as people on the right might have you believe.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Yeah, that's do you want to jump in on that, Katie?
Well, I was just going to say, I know that legislation has also been passed in Ohio that's caught up in the courts that is a 6-week abortion ban. Some Republicans did vote against it. And I do, there is a very conservative supermajority here. But as this legislation becomes more extreme, I was very interested to hear you say, Jasmine, that the amicus brief signed by conservatives in support of the law had so much less support than the one that you signed. And to me, that seems consistent with, there's been a lot of media coverage about the lack of comment from politicians who have put themselves forward as, quote unquote, pro-life, would like to wipe, any abortion under any circumstances off the face of the earth. And then when they get the exact bill to try to do that, they don't say anything. With some, special cases as exceptions to that. But what does that mean politically? Given that, that means that they are seeing real political risk. And so how does that ultimately impact how this plays out legally?
Yeah. And right. And I think, right, is the Texas legislature the dog that caught the car, right? All of a sudden, this, be careful what you wish for, because, and it's also no secret, right, that this whole drama with both Texas and the Mississippi case that we mentioned pending in front of the Supreme Court is playing out, heading into the midterm election year, right, where the Supreme Court's probably going to decide one or both of these, but certainly the Mississippi case sometime in June of 2022. And, is this, it's hard to ever make a prediction, but if there's maybe any hope, it's that this extraordinary sort of political backlash is taking folks by surprise, I think, at that level, and maybe causing them to rethink where they were going to go.
And something I think I've learned, tell me, Jessie and Jasmine, if this sounds consistent to you, is that I think for a long time there's been this idea that the Supreme Court is completely insulated from public opinion, from which way the political winds are blowing. It seems like that bubble has kind of been burst. And but the good news is that means that they're influenced by public opinion, and public opinion is not with them on this. And so if they continue to see it as politically dangerous territory to support these laws, to me, ultimately, that takes me from a place of feeling like there's nothing I can do. It's the Supreme Court. They're the untouchables to wait, actually, if we organize across partisan lines, bring all people together and really represent how people feel on this, it's going to make it pretty precarious for them to go there.
And I wonder if you all have thoughts about also to what extent that leads into conversations around court reform, right? Which has sort of seemed to have died down for a while. And will this be a moment to kind of bring that dialogue back into the picture?
If they don't want more members of the court, then maybe that's going to influence some decisions on this too. I mean, I hate to say it, but I think we're in that place, right? Where there's so much influencing these decisions.
I agree. I agree. I feel like the Supreme Court has definitely been much more politicized currently than I can say maybe recently, although, I'm not as well versed on the Supreme Court as probably you are, Jessie. But what I will say is that if there was ever a time for reform, that time is now. We have lots of reasons, maybe to see reform outside of the politicalization of the Supreme Court, just the growth in our country. And, I think maybe it's just time to at least have a serious conversation about it. And so, that's where I am on it. I feel like we are so quick to shut something down because it sounds scary. And I think right now is not the time to go cower in our corners and shut it down. I think now is the time to have that conversation.
Yeah, not cowering certainly served the other side well in this situation. So yeah, so I see there's some questions in the chat or from attendees. So I want to put them out there. One is just, I think it was Katie who mentioned the march on October 2nd, and an attendee asked if you could say more about that.
Oh, sure. So the same folks that organized the Women's March that occurred in 2016, they are putting together organizing marches all across the country, cities all across the country. So just Google Women's March. I'll do it for you right now. I'll put a link in the chat.
Great. And then there's another question from an attendee that's directed at Jasmine. The attendee says, I'm a lawyer, not a doctor, but my sense is that the science on which Roe claimed to be based is outdated. Do you have any comments about that? And I don't know if it's specifically around like what the when viability kicks in for a fetus, for example, safety of abortion, things like that. If you want to say anything about that.
Absolutely. So not much has changed when it comes to embryology and to physiology. An embryo is still an embryo up to 8 weeks. A fetus is still a fetus from 8 weeks on to birth. And then from there, you have a baby. When it comes to viability, there is not a single study out there. There's not a single instance out there of there being a viable embryo outside of the uterus. And so that has not changed. Questions about viability and the exact week of viability might, still linger. But as far as the science on 6 weeks, that has not changed. As far as the science on fetal or embryonic cardiac activity, that science has not changed. While the heart does begin to develop very on during embryonic development, the heart is not fully developed until several weeks into the second trimester. So you're not listening to a heart, you are listening to cardiac activity. So these things are important when we're making laws that use language that is medically and factually inaccurate. And that's why it's important to have people in our legislatures, people like myself, who insist on using the proper medical terminology if you're going to have a bill that focuses on a medical procedure. Words like womb are not medically accurate. It is a uterus. Referring to the unborn as a baby is not medically accurate. These types of things are meant to evoke emotion, but they are not accurate, and that we have to be really careful about the kind of language that we use when we draw up these laws. It matters, and it matters a lot.
Thank you. Yeah, it has to be maddening as someone with a science background to see some of this stuff. I know in Ohio, we see things every day being introduced. For example, there's a bill that was kicked around where doctors had to tell patients that a medication abortion, an abortion performed with medication, could be potentially be reversed, which is just, my understanding, not a thing, not possible. Right. And a false information about a link between breast cancer and abortion, or between mental health issues and abortion. And it's another sort of piece of the battle, I think, that is being lost in the
One thing I was going to pop in and say is that, Jasmine, so true about, the science and the importance of it being accurate, but not all of us have the background that you do, right? And so we don't know some of those words are wrong. And I think in addition to that, as much like emotion is part of this on both sides, right? And I also think that we make a mistake to think that people don't also have discomfort and mixed emotions about these issues. And so, I just always want to encourage people to not be afraid to speak from a place that is not just a headspace, but a heart space on these issues. This is, I think sometimes on our side, we can say, well, here are the facts. So why doesn't everyone agree with us? And that we have to share these stories. We do have to connect with the emotion on this issue, and not be afraid to understand that there are emotions on it's a smaller minority, but of people, and to, speak also to, their interest in there being less abortions in America, and reminding people, of course, that, things like providing universal health care and paid leave in pregnancy and things like that can support women and lead to those outcomes too. But just sort of hearing the other side, remembering that there's there, as much as I think this is less complex because of how extreme this is, and that we have an opportunity actually to channel some of that emotion on our side that you actually need to kind of get people to the polls, to, get people to organize, understand the consequences.
Yeah, right. I mean, I spoke to a doctor recently who had a patient who was 10 years old and pregnant, and well past the 6-week point. And, that it was as a result of incest. And that person she could not get an abortion if she was in Texas, really just horrible things like that are the real consequences. There's a sort of big picture question here that I'd like to put out from the audience that, it seems that maybe the public, although there's been kind of a lot of awareness, especially since this Texas situation about what's going on, that folks are not really sufficiently hair on fire, worried about losing this right and losing Roe v. Wade. And why do you think that is? Is it that people really just don't think about the Supreme Court that much, that they just don't think it's really possible? Or is that about to change too, as we're really seeing the impact of this Texas law?
It's interesting. Sometimes I've heard different generations of women having conversations about this, and women who can remember the pre-Roe days having a different perspective and sort of immediately having that hair on fire feeling. And there's some sense of, younger people weren't here, they don't know that. I have a little bit of a hard time fully embracing that point of view, because I think that this is so personal in people's lives and everybody knows someone. But I do think that because of how our politics is today, there is still reticence to talk about issues that are going to feel divisive and polarizing. I have my own hesitance sometimes, you don't want to offend anybody or, get into something that is going to feel like that wedge issue. And I think that what I keep reminding myself is that this isn't a wedge issue, not this Texas abortion ban. If this is too radical for Georgia, okay, that is where we are. God bless Georgia. And I think that we need to shift our mindset a little bit here and lead with our heads and our hearts and be really leaning forward.
Yeah. I mean, I do worry about a strategy here of, or the impact of sort of these radical, extreme laws that really get the public riled up. And then, what is eventually going to happen is the Supreme Court's going to decide this case. And what it's going to do is completely gut Roe v. Wade while saying, we are not overturning Roe v. Wade, we're leaving it intact. And then there's going to be headlines that say the Supreme Court saves Roe v. Wade, and everybody's going to go back home and say, oh, thank goodness, it didn't do the bad thing. But the reality is going to be that there's nothing left, because there's a lot of, we can get a lot of mobilization around these really radical moments, but then we can't, but then the more subtle attack that has been continuing for years and years, the nuance can get lost in these conversations. And so that's what I fear the outcome of this might ultimately be.
Can I jump in really quick and just say that I agree that sometimes these things feel just a little bit like, for lack of a better way of putting it, above people's pay grade. They're just like, I don't really even understand what's going on, or I don't understand why this law is as bad as y'all are making it sound. For example, a lot of these Supreme Court cases really are just about access and, equal protection. And so things like, saying abortion providers have to have hospital admitting privileges. Well, maybe to the regular layperson, that actually doesn't sound like a bad idea. They don't actually understand why it's bad. And so I think there is an onus on those of us in this space to make sure that we're articulating why these things are bad, what is actually happening at the Supreme Court, and also having forums like this to tell people what exactly can they do, or, to give people as much information as possible. I always feel like equipping people with information is one of the biggest and best weapons that you can give someone is information. And so, that's why this is so important, because you're right. There are a lot of people out there that honestly just don't get it. And the only thing they get are the sound bites on the media and what they read on social media. And they don't actually get the breadth, the depth, and the seriousness of what's happening right now.
Yeah. So, and I kind of speaking to that point, and also to the earlier point about the emotional piece here, there's question / comment from apparently a fellow Georgian that says to Dr. Clark, can you speak to the importance of not falling into the trap of referring to these laws as heartbeat laws? And I think we did kind of comment on that, or you did. As I understand, the embryo doesn't have an actual heartbeat by 6 weeks. So it's not just inaccurate, but designed to tap into emotions. Yeah.
Correct. And to speak on the emotion, I think you're right. It is emotional. When we were hearing House Bill 481, I will never forget the Democrats brought in a bunch of doctors and medical professionals and experts to testify. And the Republicans brought in a bunch of moms, a bunch of people who had been told by their parents that they thought about getting an abortion, but thank God you're here, a lot of religious people, things like that. And it was a very stark contrast. But I think one thing that we can do, and I apologize for my dog, one thing that we can do is recognize that when a person has feelings about something, when a person has emotions about something, honestly, the government is the last person that we are consulting about our emotions. And so this is an opportunity to tell the government to butt out. This is a really deeply personal decision, and I don't need you in it. And so I think that's another angle that we can approach this when we're talking about abortion laws and restrictive abortion laws, is that the government is butting into your business. And this is one thing that they need to get out of, because you already have enough to deal with and to think about and to consult with your family about and your doctor about, without having some politician that doesn't even know you and doesn't even know how, menstrual cycles work, coming in and telling you what you can and can't do with your own body.
Yeah, and that picks up on Katie's point too, that sort of sentiment crosses party lines, right? I mean, it's not in one political party or the other. That sort of feeling of personal liberty is fundamentally American, I think. But it's actually, I see that we're already, I can't believe it, at 3:57, and so I've been instructed to just sort of give a minute to wrap up. So if you want to just take a minute each, maybe I'll turn to you, Katie, next. Then we'll close out the program.
Sure. I hadn't planned closing remarks per se, so I'll just respond to, I've loved this conversation. I think that, gosh, Jasmine, what you said is so illustrative to me in terms of that in Georgia, that the Democrats brought the doctors and the nurses and the scientists, and the other side brought the emotion. And I don't think that this is about not talking about the science. It's a both and, right? And we human beings are both and kind of people. And so I think that remembering that as we tackle these conversations, because this isn't just a legislative fight, this isn't just a court fight, this is a talk around the kitchen table kind of issue, and it is a hard issue. And I also, that was an aha for me too, Jasmine, hearing from you. Sometimes people say, oh, this is the one time that you don't want government involved. Well, yes, I do want government involved when it comes to having a school mask mandate, because that is a public health issue. This is not. This is a highly personal, emotional issue. And looking at it through that lens, I think is really helpful. So thank you.
Yeah. And I mean, I think, like when Amy Coney Barrett was appointed and to take the place of Justice Ginsburg, a friend of mine who was the executive director of an abortion clinic turned to me and said, well, I guess it's up to us now, right? And this sort of feeling of like the Supreme Court isn't going to save us. This is the moment, right? It's up to all of us now to save ourselves, kind of is the feeling that that I'm really left with. I am going to give the last word before thanking everyone over to Jasmine at this point.
Thank you. So to close, I will just say, number one, elections matter. And, the building of the courts, the federal courts, the state courts, the Supreme Court, this is a project that has been going on for a really long time. Don't sit out elections. Don't think that not participating in an election will not affect your life in some way or the life of someone that you care about. Vote in every election, midterm, presidential, local, municipal, vote in them all, because at every level of government, there are people out there that are trying to strip away some of your most basic rights. And I believe that it should be your basic right to be able to have control over your body and to have access to healthcare, in which reproductive health is healthcare. And so I will close by this. Know who your state legislator is. Right now, state legislators are sexy because we are holding a lot of power in these decisions. So know who they are and make sure they know who you are.
Thank you. Thank you to everyone who attended today and brought your questions, and thanks to our panelists. Thanks to Ryan and Jeremy, Michael, and ACS National, Chris and Peggy for being here and for supporting this programming. Everyone, thanks and have a great afternoon.